All right. So anyone who's thinking about taking the plunge and, maybe packing up and moving to Singapore, well, one of the first things you probably think about is it going to break the bank? Can I actually afford to live there?
Right.
And, we've all heard the stories. We've seen the headlines. Singapore's expensive. It's, one of the most expensive cities in the world and all that. But for this deep dive, we really want to get beyond the headlines and look at the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
So we're looking at an article here from moveandstay.com, and these guys really know their stuff. They've been helping expats and business travelers find places to stay and work in Asia for over 25 years. So
Oh.
they've got a lot of experience.
Yeah, they've seen it all.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess one of the things that always kind of jumps out is that, Singapore often gets ranked as, one of the most expensive cities in the world, up there with like Zurich and New York and places like that.
Right up there at the top.
But is that really accurate? Is that true for everyone?
Well, that's the thing. These rankings, they tend to focus on the high-end stuff, right? The fancy
Yeah.
dinners, the luxury apartments, the imported, everything.
Yeah, makes sense.
But what about the everyday costs for regular people?
Yeah.
And that's where it gets a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about, because I remember when I was in Singapore, I found, like hawker centers and stuff. And you could
Right.
get like amazing food for just a few dollars.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what's so great about Singapore. You have so many options. And, according to this article, the average monthly expenses for a single person living in Singapore, excluding rent, come to about 1,513 Singapore dollars.
Okay.
And that covers your, groceries, your utilities, transportation, miscellaneous costs.
Okay, so 1,513 a month. That's not including rent. We'll get to rent in a second.
Yeah, exactly.
But just for like living expenses.
Yeah, your everyday stuff.
Yeah, okay, so let's break that down a little bit. What exactly falls under this miscellaneous category?
Okay, so think about things like entertainment, right? Going out to the movies, concerts, or even sporting events. Then you have personal care, things like haircuts, toiletries,
Right.
clothing, all those little things that kind of add up over the month.
Yeah, all that stuff that we sometimes forget about
Exactly.
when we're thinking about the big picture.
Yeah,
Okay, so that 1,513, I mean, obviously it's an average,
of course.
but it doesn't sound completely unmanageable,
No, exactly. And that's the key takeaway here, right?
Yeah.
It really depends on your lifestyle choices.
Yeah.
You could eat every meal at a hawker center and spend, less than $10 a day, or you could go all out and, dine at Michelin star restaurants every night. So
Yeah.
it really comes down to personal preference.
All right, so let's talk about the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
The thing that everyone's probably waiting for housing, because that's usually the biggest expense anywhere you live.
Oh, absolutely.
But especially, I imagine, in a place like Singapore.
It's a major factor. And, according to the article, a studio apartment in Singapore could set you back around 2,200 Singapore dollars per month.
Okay.
Now, if you're looking for a one-bedroom apartment, that jumps to about 3,200.
Wow.
And then if you need a two-bedroom, you're looking at 4,500 Singapore dollars or more per month.
Yeah, those are some serious numbers.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that drive those prices up so high? I mean, is it just because it's Singapore, or are there specific factors?
Well, yeah, I mean, just like in any major city, location plays a huge role.
Right.
Proximity to an MRT station, which is their, fantastic metro system, will definitely push up the price. And of course, the size and age of the apartment matter as well.
Yeah.
So newer, larger places in, prime districts, they're going to command top dollar.
Right. So I guess if someone's on a tighter budget, are there more affordable areas to consider, or are you kind of stuck?
No. There are definitely more affordable options if you're willing to venture a bit further from the city center. Some neighborhoods offer a really good balance between affordability and convenience. And then, of course, there's always the option of public housing, which is a whole other topic we can dive into later.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah,
So you're telling me there's hope for those of us who aren't millionaires?
absolutely. Absolutely. There's always a way. You just got to find that sweet spot that works for you.
I like it. All right, so speaking of getting around, let's talk transportation, because I've always heard amazing things about Singapore's public transit system.
It is world class. I mean, seriously efficient, clean, and pretty affordable.
That's what I've heard.
But even with that, costs can still add up, especially if you're commuting every day.
Yeah, that's true. Anywhere you are.
Exactly.
Wow.
So what are some ways to save money on transportation?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, first things first, get yourself a stored value card for the MRT and buses.
Okay.
They offer discounts compared to single trip tickets, and you can just top them up easily.
Right.
And, think about incorporating cycling or walking into your routine for shorter trips.
Mm.
It's good for your health. It's good for your wallet.
Yeah.
And of course, you always have the option of taxis and ride-hailing apps when convenience is a priority.
Yeah, sometimes you just got to get there fast.
Exactly.
All right, so let's move on to something a little bit more fun. Let's talk about food.
Okay.
I mean, who doesn't love exploring new cuisines, trying new dishes?
Right.
And, Singapore has a reputation for being like a real foodie paradise.
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm really curious to dig into this a bit.
Yeah, Singapore's culinary scene is incredible. I mean,
Wow.
you have this amazing mix of, cultures and influences, and it really translates into just an explosion of flavors.
Heard.
And the best part is you can find delicious food at every price point.
Hmm.
So whether you're, on a tight budget or you want to splurge, there's something for everyone.
Yeah, that's one of the things I loved about it. You could go to a hawker center
Mhm.
and get an amazing meal for like, next to nothing. Or you could go to like,
Ah.
some fancy restaurant if you felt like it.
Exactly. And speaking of hawker centers, I mean, those are a must-try for anyone visiting or living in Singapore. It's like these open-air food courts, with dozens of stalls selling all these, local dishes.
Yeah, they look amazing in pictures.
Oh, they're incredible. You can find everything from Hainanese chicken rice to laksa to satay, all for ridiculously affordable prices.
Man, I'm getting hungry just thinking about it.
Right.
Okay, but let's say, I'm in the mood to cook at home.
Yeah.
What are grocery prices like in Singapore?
Well, it really depends on what you're buying and where you shop.
Okay.
Just like anywhere else. But the article gives some examples, like a loaf of bread can cost anywhere from 1.50 to 7 Singapore dollars.
Yep.
Milk is about 2.3 to $6 per liter. And a kilogram of rice will set you back, between 2.20 and $6.
Okay, those prices don't sound too crazy, actually.
No, not at all.
I mean, I guess it depends on what you're comparing it to. But
Of course.
any tips for finding like the best deals on groceries? Are there certain stores or markets that are known for being like, budget friendly?
Oh, yeah, definitely local markets are a great option for, fresh produce and other staples at, generally lower prices.
Okay.
And you can also find good deals at supermarkets, especially if you shop during sales or, look for their house brands.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about something that can be a little bit tricky, especially for expats' financial assistance.
Right.
So are there any programs or resources available to help manage living costs in Singapore?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And that's where we see, a little bit of a difference between citizens and expats.
Yep.
So the Singaporean government offers a variety of assistance programs to its citizens,
Right.
like the SG60 voucher scheme, which, provides financial support for everyday needs. But for expats, it's a bit less straightforward.
So what options do expats have? Or are they just kind of on their own?
Not entirely. I mean, many employers offer benefit packages that include things like housing allowances, transportation subsidies, or even help with school fees for children.
Okay.
So it really depends on the company and the specific role.
So it's important to do your research, I guess, when you're looking at job offers and things like that.
Absolutely. And regardless of, whether you're a citizen or an expat, budgeting and smart financial planning are just crucial for making Singapore living work.
Yeah. You got to be smart with your money.
Exactly.
All right, so speaking of budgeting, let's talk about another factor that can really impact, our wallets. Inflation.
Right.
So how has inflation been affecting the cost of living in Singapore?
Well, just like anywhere else, inflation is a reality in Singapore.
Sure.
But it's important to distinguish between what's called headline inflation and core inflation.
Okay.
So headline inflation takes into account all the items in the consumer price index,
Okay.
including, volatile things like transportation and accommodation.
Right.
Core inflation strips out those more volatile elements to give us a clearer picture of, underlying price trends.
So core inflation is kind of like a more stable indicator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And looking at the data, from moveandstay.com over the past 10 years, headline inflation in Singapore has averaged around 1.44%,
Cool.
while core inflation has been a little bit higher at 1.65%. Now, if we go back even further over the past 20 years, headline inflation averaged 2.08%,
Okay.
and core inflation was 1.86%.
So those numbers seem relatively stable.
Yeah, I mean, compared to some other countries,
Right.
they've managed inflation pretty well.
But I mean, even a small percentage, increase year after year, that can really add up over time.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Even seemingly small increases in inflation can have a noticeable impact on your purchasing power, especially over the long term.
Yeah, it's like you said earlier, even if your income's going up, you might not be able to buy as much with your money as you could before.
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
it's always something to keep in mind.
So even in like a thriving economy like Singapore's, you still got to be mindful of how inflation is affecting things.
Absolutely. It's part of the bigger picture.
All right, so let's circle back to that, most expensive city label that we talked about earlier that often gets slapped on Singapore.
Right.
And, we talked about how those rankings tend to focus on high-end spending.
Yeah, the luxury stuff.
So does the information from movingstay.com kind of help debunk that myth a little bit?
I think it does, because those cost rankings, they often overrepresent things like luxury dining, high-end rentals, imported goods,
Right.
and they don't always account for the subsidies and public services that help reduce costs for residents, especially in areas like healthcare and education.
So it's not really an apples-to-apples comparison.
Exactly. It creates this distorted view of what it actually costs to live in Singapore. The reality is, many residents, both citizens and expats, find ways to live comfortably and affordably by, taking advantage of the city's diverse offerings and making smart choices.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance. I
Exactly.
remember when I was in Singapore, I was actually amazed by how much I could do without spending a ton of money.
Oh, yeah. What were some of the things that stood out to you?
Well, the hawker centers were a revelation, obviously.
Of course.
I mean, you could eat amazing food for less than $10.
It's incredible.
But I also found plenty of like free or low-cost activities like exploring the parks and gardens,
Yeah.
checking out the museums, even just wandering through the different neighborhoods.
Right.
There was so much to see and do without breaking the bank.
And that's a great point. Singapore has so much to offer beyond, the glitz and the glamour.
Yeah.
And it's definitely possible to enjoy the city on a budget if you're willing to explore and be a little adventurous.
I like it. All right.
Mm.
So to wrap things up, what are some key takeaways we want our listeners to remember from this deep dive into Singapore's cost of living?
Well, first and foremost, Singapore's cost of living can definitely be high, but it's manageable with careful budgeting and smart choices.
Cool.
You don't have to be a millionaire to live there.
Okay. Good point number 2.
Takeaway number 2, that expensive city label that we talked about, it's often misleading and doesn't reflect the experience of, many residents who actually live there.
Okay. And the final takeaway.
Okay.
And the final takeaway?
I think the final takeaway is don't let that perception of Singapore being unaffordable, stop you from exploring what it has to offer. Do your research, think about your priorities, and be open to, discovering the city's hidden gems. And you might be surprised at what you find.
Yeah, I love that it's a reminder that there's always more to discover and, cost shouldn't be the only thing holding us back from experiencing a new place.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of these deep dives. It's not just about giving you all the answers. It's about, sparking your curiosity, encouraging you to keep exploring.
Well said. I bet our listeners are already itching to, book those flights and experience Singapore for themselves.
I wouldn't be surprised who can resist delicious food, amazing architecture, and a vibrant culture.
Especially when you realize it doesn't have to cost a fortune. So we've learned that while Singapore, might have this reputation for being expensive, it's much more nuanced than that.
Right.
By making smart choices, embracing, local experiences and prioritizing value, it's totally possible to enjoy this incredible city without breaking the bank.
Absolutely. Remember, this deep dive is just the beginning of your journey.
Yeah.
There's a whole world of information out there waiting to be discovered. Keep exploring and challenging those perceptions.
I love it. Until next time, fellow explorers, keep diving deep and stay curious.